Buenas tardes, soy José María Beneito, catedrático Jean Monnet de la Unión Europea. Es un gran placer poder presentar hoy una nueva conferencia del profesor Grzegorz Ekiert sobre democracia y autoritarismo en el siglo XXI. El profesor Ekiert es catedrático de Gobierno, ostenta la cátedra Laurence A. Tisch en la Universidad de Harvard, es director del Centro de Estudios Europeos Minda de Günzburg y académico de la Academia de Estudios Internacionales y de Área de Harvard. En el Center for European Studies, en el Centro de Estudios Europeos de la Universidad de Harvard, copreside el seminario sobre democracia, pasado, presente, futuro. La investigación y la enseñanza del profesor Ekiert se centran en la política comparada, el cambio de régimen y la democratización, la sociedad civil y los movimientos sociales y la política y las sociedades de Europa del Este. Por tanto, uno de los grandes especialistas mundiales en la evolución de la democracia, en las crisis de la democracia, con un foco particular en el este y centro de Europa, pero también en un aspecto comparativo con el resto del mundo. Entre sus libros más destacados figuran Capitalismo y democracia en el este y el centro de Europa, Protesta popular y consolidación democrática en Polonia, crisis políticas y sus consecuencias en el este y el centro de Europa, y sus trabajos se han publicado también en numerosas revistas de ciencias sociales y volúmenes editados en Estados Unidos, en Europa y en Asia. Para la Fundación Ramón Areces es una gran satisfacción poder contar con la conferencia hoy en día del profesor Grzegorz Ekiert, a quien solicito por favor que venga a dictar su conferencia.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the Fundación Ramón Areces for this very kind invitation to Madrid, and thank you to Professor Beneito for arranging this and for this very kind introduction. I'm delighted to be in Madrid. This is one of my favorite places in the world, and I'm very delighted that I have this opportunity to visit again. Now I'm going to talk today about issues which are very difficult. I think that any of you who watches television news and reads newspaper knows already that democracy is not in a good shape around the world. We have this brutal Russian aggression going on in Ukraine. We have a victory of Viktor Orban in Hungary in the recent not-so-free elections. We have a very close election, surprisingly, in France. So everywhere you look, I think there are signs of trouble. It seems that the world is in a turning point. And this turning point leads in very different direction than the previous turning point, by which I mean 1989, this liberal moment. What I'm going to talk today about would be several issues. First of all, I reflect a little bit on the past, and then I will focus on democratic backsliding and what I call the dictatorial drift. Then I will talk a little bit about explanations. So today I'm going to talk about a few issues. I will reflect a little bit on the previous turning point in 1989-91. And then I will describe the process of democratic backsliding and something which I call the dictatorial drift. Reflect a little bit on a way in which we can explain those developments. And then I will focus on the specific part of the world, namely on East Central Europe, the former post-communist countries, trying to illustrate empirically those two processes which I have in mind. So let me first start with a discussion of of 1989. At that time, during the transformations which led to the end of the Cold War and collapse of the communist rule, we assumed that this liberal moment is going to last. This was the end of history. This was the final victory of liberal political order, and we all believed that this is exactly the case. Now, 30 years later, we now see how mistaken we were and how difficult this last 20 years has been. So let me quote here Anne Applebaum, the very insightful observers of what's going on in the world politics. So Anne Applebaum claims that if the 20th century was the story of slow and even progress toward the victory of liberal democracy over other ideologies, communism, fascism, and virulent nationalism, the 21st century is so far the story of the reverse. And there is a lot of evidence to back it up. And I will present some of those evidence. It may be familiar to you. So first, let's look at the recent report of the Freedom House. Freedom House is an American foundation which is monitoring the state of democracy, the state of freedom around the world. And here is the latest point Freedom House is making, that what we see over the last 16, 17 years is the steady decline of freedom and liberty in the world. So the last time countries which were making progress toward more liberal, more free political order over the countries which were departing from free and political order was in 2005. Since then, we see more countries declining in political scores, in quality of democracy and liberal politics, than countries which are making progress. I think the worst score we see on this is last year, where only 25 countries made some progress, and over 60 countries turned their back on freedom and democracy. Now, this argument can be developed a little bit farther just to show you more empirical evidence for this. VDEM is another big project of monitoring democracy. This is called the Varieties of Democracy. And VDEM has been presenting two types of countries. Countries which are moving in democratic directions and countries which are moving in the authoritarian direction. So when we look at the number of countries moving in one direction or another, this line shows the countries moving in democratic direction. And as you see, the peak was around year 2000. And since then, the number of countries moving in democratic direction has been steadily declining, moving to a very low level, lower than in 1971. At the same time, and this is the line for countries moving in authoritarian direction, we have this line going up, and at that moment we have again a higher number of authoritarian countries than we had in 1971. And also the number of people living in authoritarian regimes is going dramatically up, as the second graph shows. And this is mainly because the biggest countries in the world are moving in the authoritarian directions. So today, when we look back, in 2011, only 49% of people in the world live in authoritarian regimes. Today, 70% of people in the world are living in the authoritarian regime. Now, why democracy is retreating? Why do we see that shift from democracy to authoritarianism and then shift from people living in free liberal societies to people living in oppressive authoritarian regimes? There are a couple of arguments about this process. So the first argument is about the crisis of democracy. We know from many research in political science that in moments in the modern history where democracy was in retreat, when democracy was perceived to be in crisis, we have the number of authoritarian regimes going up. And here, a couple of quotations from very recent work. Yasha Monk, in Peace in the Atlantic, argues that because of that perception of democratic crisis, the authoritarians no longer need to hide their authoritarian ambitions. The commentator from Financial Times, Gideon Rahman, is making a point that Putin and Xi, the leaders of two huge authoritarian countries, are working together to make world safe for autocratic regime. So that's the first argument. Now, the second argument is about the rise of strong men. And I think this is again the quotation from recent or about to be published book by Gideon Rahman, pointing to that regularity. That wherever we look in the world, suddenly we see the strong men coming to power and starting to rule in authoritarian way. Whether it's Moscow, whether it's Beijing, but also New Delhi, also Budapest and Warsaw. So all over the place, we see this kind of leaders assuming positions of authorities and changing the nature of politics in their own country. Now, the third argument about this, I will rely here on Anne Applebaum's piece in the Atlantic recently, tells us something about the nature of the contemporary autocracies. So there are a couple of characteristics today which are very important. So first of all, there is no big ideological divisions among autocracies. In the past, we had fascists, we had communists. There were big ideological differences. Today, all the autocrats are nationalists. So there is a unity in the ideological dimension, which makes situation more dangerous because they can easily cooperate with one another in ways they were not able to cooperate in the past. Moreover, those new authoritarian regimes accept the state capitalism. They all have a similar economic systems run by kleptocratic elites, as Anne Applebaum argues. And so again, there is no huge division in the way they think about the proper economic system. They also developed a very powerful new mechanisms of information control and mechanisms of propaganda. I don't need to give you examples. Think about the Great Wall, Internet Wall in China. Those technologies have been sold to Russia. Now Russia is able to block all the external information and so on. And we are living in the world which is divided electronically, technologically into two spheres. You cannot watch the Western media in China or Russia. And of course, no one really, besides the expert, watches the Chinese propaganda pieces or Russian propaganda pieces in the West. But we have this clearly technological divide, dividing information and communication. And of course, we have development of very effective security apparatus and procedures which are shared between the countries. So when Lukashenko, the leader of Belarus, was challenged by the protest movement after stolen elections, Belarusian security apparatus was not able to control the situation for many days until the plane loads of Russian experts from the secret police arrived in Minsk. and started to control the situation, teaching the Belarusian counterparts of how to use the force, what kind of actions should be taken to prevent the protest, and so on. So again, we have this shared union of countries having similar security apparatus. And finally, what we see is the collusion between those countries. There is a very close collaboration today between authoritarians around the world. That collaboration is important for keeping the authoritarian regimes safe. The smaller ones are kept going because they have really, the umbrella put over them by bigger authoritarian regimes. Think about Venezuela, how Russians and Chinese and Cubans were trying to move around the sanctions imposed by the US, and that applies to many other places. So this is anti-Western, and it's trying to shield those authoritarian regimes from any consequences they can they can have by breaking the norms and the rules of political behavior in the world scene and in domestic politics as well. So this is the third argument about the nature of authoritarian rule. But let me emphasize something else, and something which I think is not as well known as arguments about the crisis of democracy and backsliding from democratic regime. We have another process going on in the world, which I call the authoritarian drift. As much as democratic regimes are moving away from norms of democracy, the authoritarian regimes in the world are moving away from the soft forms of authoritarian rule to the hard forms of authoritarian rule. And again, some observers noticed that process. So Thomas Friedman, very perceptive observer of international situation and commentator for the New York Times, made recently this argument that he thinks that the most dangerous aspect of the contemporary world is the fact that leaders of very powerful countries have more unchecked power than ever before. So he argues that Putin has much more unchecked power than Stalin, or as much unchecked power as Stalin had, and that President Xi has as much unchecked power as any leader since Mao Zedong. This is important development. I think the war we see in Europe today precisely relates to this, that one person could make that decision and send hundreds of thousands of troops to fight completely unjust and justifiable war. So that process is very important, and we should pay more attention to it. I will make few illustrations, more specific illustration of those two processes, and I will show what we know about democratic backsliding and this move toward dictatorial rule in countries which emerged from the former Soviet Union and the former Soviet bloc. And there is a lot of surprises after 30 years of those transformations, which we see both in the countries which were considered in the past to be the leaders of democratic transformations and market reforms, to countries which were always considered to be the dictatorial countries. Now, let's go back to Freedom House. Freedom House has another report in which they look at all countries which emerged from the collapse of the communist bloc. And as the general report notes this decline of freedom around the world, this specific edition focusing on Eastern Europe see the similar trend. So as they say in 2001 edition of the report, 18 countries had declining political score, and this was 17 consecutive years in which those countries were sliding back on the initial democratic systems they established after 89. Among those countries which slided the farthest back are the two former leaders of democratization and democratic transformation. Poland experienced the biggest slide in the quality of democracy, followed just by Hungary. And very few countries made some progress. Let me illustrate this a little bit different way, and to make this division, which I think is very important, between countries which were democracies and how they are sliding back, how their democracies are becoming of lower quality, and the authoritarian countries, which were some sort of soft authoritarian systems, how they are sliding back, becoming more dictatorial. And I will use the Freedom House data to show this. Okay, so here are the countries which in 2005 were considered whether consolidated or semi-consolidated democracies. As you see, in 2021, almost 2 decades later, there are only 2 countries which retain the same level of freedom, the same level of quality of democracy, and those countries are Estonia and Croatia. Every other country lost ground, and as previous slides show, those losing the most ground are Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Slovenia, which was the leader of transformation as well. So this is democratic backsliding. This is how it looks. And what is troubling about this, that almost all countries which emerged from the collapse of the Soviet bloc are sliding back in those scores for the quality of democracy. So let's look what's going on with the countries. Okay, so let me take this back and make a more systematic point about what is going on in this backsliding countries of Eastern Europe. I think that they all fit very well the test which Steve Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt developed in the book of How Democracies Die, because in all those countries we start to see, first of all, the weak commitment to democratic rule and the weak commitment to rule of law. We see the efforts to delegitimize political opposition. We see growing tolerance of violence, especially by right-wing, nationalistic, far-right social movements and groups. And we see clear attempts to restrict civil liberties and freedom of media. There are countless examples of this coming from almost all countries in the region. I have no time really to say more about this or give you more examples. Now, here is this second process which I mentioned, this dictatorial drift. Now, here are the countries which in 2005 were considered to be either hybrid or semi or fully consolidated authoritarian systems. Now, as we see, there is a very similar dynamic going on here as in the previous slide about democracies. We see that most of the countries really declined and became much more dictatorial than before, with the small exception of couple of countries from the peripheries of the former Soviet Union, which did not make much progress, but at least did not decline in dramatic way. Most other countries did. So again, Freedom House tells us that in the score from 7 to 1, now we have 8 countries which cannot be ranked lower. This is the lowest score which the country can get in that index of political system. So these are all dictatorial regimes in which the leaders have unchecked power and can do whatever they please. And the fact that Belarus and Russia are here on that list tells us something about the war which is going on in Ukraine. So let me point to a paradox which has not been much discussed. That the moment in which the countries of that region were the most free was after the transition. The first few years after the transition, there was more freedom in Russia, there was more freedom in many countries of Central Europe than there is today. So that's one paradoxical finding, that everyone is worse off politically today. And the second finding, which is important, is that those countries in sub-regions of Eastern Europe, this is Central Europe, the countries like Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, Baltic republics. This is Central Asia. These are the post-Soviet states and so on. Those countries never reached the very high level of freedom except for Central Europe. They travel over the last 30 years on sort of parallel trajectories and never really gain much political freedom and democratic rule. So that's what is happening in Central Europe in general way. We see the trend of democratic backsliding among the countries which were democracies before, and we see the trend of the dictatorial drift in countries which were soft authoritarian systems in the past. Now, the big question, how we explain that? What is going on in this part of the world that brings those countries into authoritarian direction? And as you know, there is a lively discussion going on among social scientists and commentators about ways in which we can explain that. The most popular explanation is the first one, which is advanced by political economists, and that explanation by and large tells us that after the collapse of communism, there were very harsh neoliberal economic reforms imposed on those countries, which produced the growing inequalities, which produced the retrenchment of the welfare state, and a lot of victims of transition, and now those victims of transitions are fueling the populist movements and authoritarian movements around Eastern Europe. I want to just signal, and I will show you a couple of more things, that I don't consider this explanation to be very credible. The second explanation is one which was recently proposed by Krastev and Holmes, which is a little bit similar to the previous one. But in this view, it's not much about the economic reforms, but about norms and values which were imposed on countries of Eastern Europe, those post-communist countries, by the West. So the West, in a way, colonized those countries, forcing them to imitate the West. The accession process to the European Union is considered as an example of how those countries were forced to follow the rules, exactly the ones which were important for the European Union, and so on. Again, we may quarrel with this, how much really imitation there was. Were there forces in those countries which were very eager and willing to accept the democratic norms and rules and so on? So this is something which is not settled yet. Now, the third explanation is about party politics, that something happened within the party politics in those countries, and we have the rise of nationalistic parties which came up with clever political messaging and were able to mobilize people who didn't like the current situation for one way or another. So the consensus which we had at the beginning of the transition in the 1990s around liberal values and liberal politics suddenly changed into consensus about nationalistic values and nationalistic politics. And finally, there is an argument by Kim Scheppele, a political scientist or sociologist from Princeton University, in which Kim, in a very precise way, shows how those new states are constructed to really advance the interest of the authoritarian leaders. Now, I would like to say that there is a grain of truth in all those explanations, that there is, some are more true than others. What I'm going to show you very briefly why the most popular one is not very convincing, and also make an argument about some other dimension of development which we've been missing for many years. So Poland, as you saw in previous slides, Poland is the biggest slider in East Central Europe. Country with great democratic history, with great solidarity movement, with Lech Wałęsa, fight for freedom in 1989, gave the light to all the other countries in the region, now is ruled by nationalistic, clerical, and authoritarian political party. But this is not because of the economic developments. Poland has been incredible success story economically. To that extent that a couple of years ago, the World Bank moved Poland from the middle income status to the high income status. This is the first country in like 2 decades which made this kind of progress acknowledged by the international community. And in the process of doing this, poverty in Poland declined in absolutely dramatic way. It's lower now in Poland than in West European countries. So inequality and poverty are very low. GDP per capita increased 5 times. The standards of living really increased in absolutely incredible way over this very short period of time, right? So this is a tiger, economic tiger. This is a great success story. But it's not about numbers as such. It is also about perceptions, right? So one of the Polish public opinion bureaus is tracing people's views about their family situation. The question is your family doing well, or is your family doing badly? So as you see here, when the transition started in 1992, less than 20% of Poles were declaring that their families are doing well. Now, today, this number is 70%. At the same time, the number of families, number of Poles who claim that their families are not doing well declined from 40% at the beginning of the transition to almost single digits today. So even in perceptions of the economic situation, you see that people on average are much more happy about the economic situation than they ever been before. And this is exactly in the moment where those authoritarian parties are winning power in the region. So what is going on? What are we missing? Why countries like parties like Law and Justice in Poland maintain and change level of support among the population? Why is it that Viktor Orban political party despite attacks on media, despite expelling the university, first time from the fascist times. This happened in Europe, despite really concerted action against freedom and liberties in Hungary. Why this party has still this level of support? As I said, this is not because Hungarians or Poles are victims of the economic transition. So the argument I would like to make, and this is a part of the explanation which should really make this picture more broad and more convincing. The argument I want to make is that there is a preference for authoritarian rule in many, if not all, countries of the region, and not only in Eastern Europe, but also in lesser extent in Western Europe, right? The great Polish journalist made this point. This is not a problem that Poland has the government it does. The problem is that that government can get the majority in the parliament in free elections. This is the problem, right? So why people are voting for that party? The argument he makes is that the leader of that party figured out that there is a big constituency who doesn't care about liberal values and Western values. And he was able, in a very clever way, to build that coalition, and that electorate brought him and his party to power. So we need to acknowledge that there is a big anti-liberal camp in each of those countries, and they like what they hear from leaders like Kaczynski and Orban. They don't like liberal values, they don't like European Union, and they express those preferences in the elections today. Those views, nationalism, homophobia, resonate in a very clear way with those electorates, as the sociologist Bonikowski show in a very convincing way. So the problem is that you cannot have democracy without democrats. We believed at the beginning of the transition that by clever institutional fixes, we can force people to behave like democrats. Now we know that we fail in institutional manipulation, that you cannot make non-democrats democrats through changing institutions, that you make non-democrats into democrats through an effort to educate people, in an effort to make sure that liberal values are supported by society and by the state. Now, what are those views which produce the preference for authoritarian rule? Can we identify it in those places in Eastern Europe? Now, there is a bunch of things which people point to when they ask the question why people vote for leaders like Hitler or Mussolini, or why do they vote for Putin, and why do they vote for Orban or Kaczynski. So the first set of indicators is about skepticism toward representative institutions, toward liberal values, support for strong authority, and we can get this from the public opinion polls. Then there is argument about psychological traits, very often coined as authoritarian personality. These are people who support conservative values, who support order, patriarchy, respect for tradition, and so on. There is also something about local communities and the characteristic of those local communities. Ernest Gellner, the great British anthropologist, called those communities tyranny of cousins. And the famous anthropologist who studied Italy many years ago called those communities amoral familism, where the values of families are principled, that they don't care about others, what is important is the solidarity within family. There are two other things which are important. Something which are called arrested secularization. This is a paradox that after almost 50 years of communist rule, which the communists were hostile to organize religions everywhere, in Russia and Eastern Europe, that those countries are the most religious countries in Europe today. That's something which calls for really important investigation and explanation. Why is it that those anti-Catholic, anti-religious politics produce so much support for very conservative type of Catholicism, very conservative type of Orthodoxy? And then the last thing I can point out is anxiety about identity. And I think this is something which we see in many of those countries, especially in small ones. So let me briefly run through, couple of evidence just to substantiate those points with some empirical data. So the Public Opinion Bureau in the US called Pew had this comparative research done in 2017 in which they asked Europeans, West and East, the same questions. Out of this, they constructed the index of democracy. We're trying to figure out in which countries there is a lot of support for democracy and in which countries there is very little support for democracy. So, as you see from this, in places like Sweden, 52% are fully committed to democracy. In places like Russia, in the very bottom, only 7% of people are fully committed to democracy. And Poland and Hungary are very low on this as well. So there is no committed Democrats or very few committed Democrats in many countries of Eastern Europe. I would like to point out that Spain is not doing very well on this index as well. Now, difference between East and West is striking. 30 years after Europeanization process and joining European Union by many of those countries. Couple of examples. A question: is being Christian important for national identity, for being a Pole, being a Hungarian, and so on? In Eastern Europe, the average is 58%, the yellow dot. In Western Europe is 32, so more than 20 points difference. Now, another big difference. Do you favor legal same-sex marriages? Only 16% in Eastern Europe, vis-a-vis 75% in Western Europe. Should abortion be legal? Again, 56 says yes in Eastern Europe, 81% says yes in Western Europe. Would you be willing to accept Muslims in your family? Only 27% of East Central Europeans are saying yes, vis-a-vis 66% of West Europeans. So we have tremendous cultural gap after 30 years of transformations and travels and open borders and exchange of information and so on between West and East. And East Europeans really don't trust people. This is a public opinion poll done in Poland for the last 20 years. And the question is, which view is closer to your view? And the orange one says, in relations to other people, you have to be very careful. Right? So it's 75% of the Polish population really don't trust the others, and that's indication of those really elements of authoritarian personality or the authoritarian communities we have. And another example about the anxiety about identity, right? So Poles, Hungarians, Slovaks, and Czechs were asked, do you agree with the statement that together with the increase of immigration, we are going to lose our cultural identity? And as you see here, 73% of Czechs are afraid they're going to lose their national cultural identity, and Slovaks and Hungarians a little bit less in Poland. So again, that's another example. And then when you ask the question, which Pew Research Center does, it's very interesting. Our people are not perfect, but our culture is superior. Now, as you see, 70% people in Russia agree with this. 55% of people in Poland think that Polish culture is superior, and only 45% of Germans think that their culture is superior. So there is this inferiority complex which we see across the board in Eastern Europe. Now, religion. That argument about arrested secularization. As you see today in Poland, after 30 years of transition, still more than 80% of people declare that they believe in God and they take part in religious practices. Only 7% really declare that they are not non-believers. And what else is happening to the believer community in Poland is that while the number of people attending Sunday Mass has been declining over the years, the number of people taking communion is on the increase. This can be interpreted as the process in which the Polish Catholicism is becoming more fundamentalist. Right, that there are fewer people practicing, but those who practice in a much more serious way than they did in the past. Okay, so let me conclude and make a couple of parting arguments. Why we see democratic backsliding in those countries which were democracies in Eastern Europe. First of all, and that's the point I emphasize through this talk, is that authoritarians are winning because they have significant public support in their countries, and they have committed international allies. Polish government fights European Commission for rule of law because it has support of the Hungarian government, and vice versa, right? As much as authoritarians support one another, those countries with backsliding democracies support one another as well. The second point I would like to make is that cultural modernization takes time. We see after 30 years of transformations and 30 years after joining Europe, those countries in Central and Eastern Europe are far behind in terms of values and commitments than countries of Western Europe. And I think it is worth emphasizing that democracy needs Democrats, that those countries which want to protect democracy should make a really serious effort to make sure that children and young people are being trained, have possibility to learn about democracy and democratic practices, and they are being socialized into supporting liberal values. Support for the authoritarian values varies between countries. In some, those constituencies voting authoritarian are bigger than in other countries. But the one thing which we need to remember is that those people who vote authoritarian do it because they believe in it, right? These are not people who are voting authoritarian because of, the economic problems. These are people who have preference for authoritarian rule, preference against Europe, preference against liberal values, don't like homosexuals, and so on, and so on, and so on. So we need to take the voters' expressed preferences seriously to be able to understand what is going on. Now, 3 more points. there is this puzzle of why communism, which was by and large a modernization project, did not modernize those societies, right? So communist systems preserve this traditional anti-liberal system of norms and values, and those norms and values are grounded in the peripheral European position. These are sort of historical roots. But the communists didn't change that, right? Quite opposite. In the end of the communist period, those countries, people in those countries were more committed to religion and more committed to the liberal and non-liberal values than they were before the communists took over. There is some explanation of that, but I don't have time to go into details. Now, the next important point is that churches and what is the right-wing pillar of civil society, movements, organizations, foundations, are the main carriers of illiberal values and rising nationalism. The churches started to organize. There is a big story to be told about this. The churches in the 1990s started a very powerful effort to organize a segment of civil society which is allied with the churches. So at this point, the anti-liberal pillar of civil society in places like Poland is as strong as the liberal pillar. We know about all the NGOs and progressive foundations and protests for liberal causes, but we know much less about groups and organizations which fight for traditional causes, fight against liberal values, can organize huge demonstrations and actions across the country. There is equivalence between those forces, and these are the institutional foundation of the process. And then something which I emphasized already a couple of times, the rise of nationalist and authoritarian project is not a response to specific event or a specific crisis. There is this stable constituency for authoritarian rule in all countries in the world. You see this in the US, you see this in Poland, you see this in Hungary, you see this in Russia. The question is, can that silent group of supporters be mobilized, and when they become the important part of politics? For that, we need to have, of course, the populist and nationalist parties which contest the elections, and the moment they win elections, then those anti-liberal constituencies are becoming even stronger. So here it is. The world is facing two big problems. One is the democratic backsliding, but the other, even more dangerous, is the process of dictatorial drift, in which the soft authoritarian systems are becoming the hard dictatorships. Thank you very much.